All right, in this second video for Module 2, I'm going to hit on a couple of key themes that are discussed in the text and just give you some examples. Now, of course, it's very important that you read the text. The module quiz will strongly emphasize many of those ideas, but some of these ideas will be present as well, and make sure that you kind of see how they work and interact together. So, where are we going? Well, today, what we will be doing next Okay, this is the second video in the Module 2 series. Remember, make sure that you read the text well. What I'm going to do today is talk about some of the themes in the second reading for Module 2, or the second reading in the first chapter, which relates to Module 2. And we're going to be talking about culture, a little bit about the concept of region. Again, I'm going to go back at that, and then in general, human geographies. So again, today, key ideas. We're going to define culture and look at some components of it. We're going to look at this idea of what we call the demographic transition, which links the previous component of this module, that is human population, to the other themes. And then we're going to deal with these themes in some detail, and that is political geographies, economic geographies, and then globalization. And in all of these, really, culture is the underlying element. All right, so let's take a look at this. First of all, we need to understand what culture is. Culture, broadly speaking, is that set excuse me, that set of ways of being for human beings that, in a sense, informs everything that we do. So what we can say culture is that set of learned beliefs, technologies, rituals, communication strategies that are shared by a group. Now, it has to be learned and it has to be shared. It is intrinsic to our way of life. It is also a material and non-material component. Okay? It has a material and non-material component. In other words, if we think about it, the computer that you're looking at right now is a piece of material culture. That is something that we have made. It is technology. We've learned how to make this. The technology is shared by a group. It has both utility, when we talk about material culture, and meaning. That is, the computer has utility. We do something with it. But it also has meaning. It carries with it some intrinsic meaning. That is, a computer means that we engage with information. A computer today means a mode of getting information. A type of clothing might be material culture that not only protects you from the weather, but it also might carry, for example, some symbology that suggests your culture group, or your age, or your gender, your orientation, your political leaning. So material culture has that utility and meaning. Non-material culture carries the same thing. Language that we use has utility. We communicate an idea. But the way that we use language also carries meaning in and of itself. So is it informal? Is it formal? Is it hierarchical? So culture is that which is learned behaviors, beliefs, systems of interaction that are both material and non-material. So let's take a look at this picture. This happens to be down in the Strip District in Pittsburgh. And what we see here are a whole slew of elements of culture. So first of all, we have a landscape that has a building in it. So a building is a piece of material culture. The building, in fact, has certain utilities. It might be for selling things. But you'll notice also on here, it is a venue for expression in terms of art. Now, if we look at some other pieces here, we can actually read a culture. You'll notice that men are wearing shorts. And they're wearing shorts in a public setting. Well, that, to some degree, certainly defines it as a Western landscape, Western culture. More specifically, we also see men wearing baseball caps that are not playing baseball. And those caps have a meaning to them. They carry both utility, keep the sun out of your eyes, but they say something about them. So all of these pieces, we can in fact read a culture. We can read what is said and in some respects unsaid. If we can read it, we tend to be part of the culture. When we can't read those signs, those symbols, we're not part of the culture. So I'm not talking about just the do not enter sign. What I'm saying is we read shorts on this as okay. If we were from another culture, for example, quite often in Western Asian cultures, for example, in Iran, you might not see men very often wearing shorts. That would be kind of an unusual thing to do. And so wearing shorts would say, if you're in Iran, you're not probably from this culture, and vice versa. All right. So again, some of these things are very distinct. We talked about placedness. Well, placedness comes in part from culture. I look at this sandwich and I see French fries and an egg on a sandwich. Many parts of the country would look at this as a very strange sandwich. If you're from Pittsburgh, though, this is part of your culture, and it just looks like a good sandwich. So we read elements of material culture. Material culture can change in meaning or evolve. If you'll notice here, this happens to be a place called the Church Works Brewery. Now, what's interesting about it is historically that building was a Catholic church, and it had both utility, and it's a building for worship, excuse me, but it also had meaning as in a center to the Catholic group within this part of Pittsburgh. Well, today it's been changed. That meaning and its utility has been fundamentally altered to be a brewery and a restaurant. Now that means something, that culture, the other important element of culture, is it changes. Culture is dynamic. It's not static. It changes through time, and those changes are very important to the way that we understand culture from a geographic standpoint. All right, so one other aspect, very important aspect of culture is language itself. And I want to point out that here are some terms that, again, I'm not from Pittsburgh, and when I came here, the idea of saying the lawn needs mowed sounds just strange to me. Growing up in the Midwest, if we look right here, I would say the lawn needs to be mowed, or the lawn needs mowing. But in Pittsburgh, that to be or the mowing is dropped, and instead they say in this area the lawn needs mowed, the car needs washed. Another phrase that identifies you as from this region is when you say red up as a way of saying clean up or tidy up a room. Again, when I came here, I had no idea what that meant. So culture is carried by language, it is carried by behaviors and beliefs, customs, traditions, and by material elements, the meaning they carry and their utility. All right, so culture. We see it on the landscape, and in some cases, it's very unusual. So here's a picture. Recently I was in Beijing, and if you look at this, one of the things that you'll notice is that it's a very sunny day, and yet everyone is carrying umbrellas. We don't see that in the United States. Umbrellas in this part of China are really primarily, or at least in a significant way, are sun shades. Getting a suntan is not something that people want to do in this area, and so it's not seen as a sign of, if we kind of think people that are nice and tan, they're healthy. In this area, that would be seen as somebody that was rural or was of low income. And so umbrellas keep primarily women pale. And so again, the same technology, but in different cultures, the technology carries a different meaning. All right, so when we can think of one that's been in the news today, and I don't want to get into whether the pros or cons or politics of this, but the firearms that are present in the United States make our culture very distinct. If you look at civilian gun ownership, what you can see here is that there is a very distinct break between what we see in, for example, the United States and Canada, and then as you move into Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Asia, gun ownership almost drops to zero. So it is a piece of material culture, a firearm. What does it mean? In the United States, it carries an immense amount of meaning, and in fact, carries political meaning. That meaning ties to politics and economics. And we have to understand that culture underlies many of those aspects. Now, we can also look at this and we can begin to say, again, cultures evolve. This was a headline that showed up a couple of years ago and now has changed. In Saudi Arabia, there was a ban based on a belief system for women driving automobiles. Because of pressures both internally and externally, women began to push back against that. Within Islamic culture, the women began to agitate for that, and today women can drive in Saudi Arabia. So that element of their culture has changed. And yet, when we look at this image, and I put this image up in part is also for this, notice the difference in what is being worn. So cultures change in some respects, and other parts of the culture may stay the same. Always a question of cultures evolve, cultures change, cultures push back against other cultures. All right, so let's take that. Now, culture is an underlying aspect, but it informs everything that we do. And I want to link culture to the other elements through this idea of what we call the demographic transition. Now, from your text, the important idea, the demographic transition is a way to understand how populations change over time and how that change in population can be associated with economics as well as changes in technology. So if you'll read the text, what you'll notice is this, the demographic transition deals essentially with three elements. Crude birth rates at the top here, crude death rates, and then the total population. Now, we learned in our last exercise that birth rates and death rates essentially are what cause populations to change through time. When birth rates are high and death rates are high, there's essentially no change in the population. But you'll notice in the demographic transition, and first I'm going to point out what happens, and we're going to talk about a little bit about why. In stage one, births and deaths are high and essentially even, so population stays the same. In stage two, death rates begin to drop quickly while birth rates stay high. Well, if births stay high, deaths drop, population is going to grow. In stage three, our deaths drop and then level out. They kind of reach kind of a limit, if you will, but births then begin to drop. So if deaths get to a low level and births begin to decline, well, our rate, in other words, the curve here, is going to begin to slow. It's going to decrease its growth, if you will. Still going to grow until in stage four, towards the end, births continue down, and eventually they essentially get back to a point where, excuse me, where births and deaths again are equal. Our population is at a new higher level, but it stays at that level. Now there is, at least in what we're beginning to see, especially in Western Europe, a stage 5 where birth rates actually decrease below replacement level, and that's where we begin to see population decline. So again, demographic transition has 5 stages. What I want to point out is that really no country in the world is in stage 1, and very few countries are beginning to enter into this part of stage 5. Now, why does it happen? Well, what many people have argued is that this first stage is essentially a pre-industrial agrarian stage. And it's actually even before what we would consider the agricultural developments of the latter part of the 1700s. So right here, what we have essentially is almost a feudal system where agricultural production was limited to subsistence, and deaths were very high because of a lack of medical technology, high risk of famine, and simply accidental deaths. So stage 1, if you want to think about it from a Western European standpoint, is pre-1750. Well, then stage 2 is the beginnings of mechanized agriculture and the expansion of food production and transportation. Those two things reduce the impacts of famine and increase the distribution of food. Food technologies, even basic food technologies like the self-scouring plow in the United States, better seed lines, basic implements technology, increased food production so that deaths due to starvation, and at the same time here, what we also see is an increase in basic sanitation. Water becomes a little bit more safe. We understand the basics of germ theory. And as that happens, death rates drop dramatically. Even though that's the case, as long as we're primarily agrarian, children, large families, have an economic incentive. Even if your farm's doing well, more children on the farm means more cheap labor. It's an easy way to think about it. But as societies moved into industrialization, urbanized, having children in a city was essentially a cost burden. They didn't work, or to any great degree, and they required economic inputs, so your wages had to go towards them. So as we moved into the industrial age, and especially the urbanization age, that is the end of the 1800s, early 1900s, what we begin to see is this decrease in birth rates. Birth rates also decrease because women are integrated into the labor pool. That continues into the later 20th century, and in fact, much of Europe and certainly North America is at this stage in 4 where deaths have equilibrated. We're kind of at a point where people are really only dying now from diseases of agedness. And that's primarily the cause of death. And birth rates have dropped dramatically. Essentially, we've gone to this point of replacement. Now, what we see in Europe is that, again, we're even into that point where negative, in other words, not only not having a lot of children, but having only one child or no children, as women fully integrate into the labor pool. Tertiary economies make it advantageous to stay in the labor pool a long time, and that's really stage 5. So changes in culture, changes in technology, changes in economics have transformed population over time. Now what you'll see as you read the text and as we move through the semesters, we're going to see different countries in different regions in different stages 2, 3, 4, and 5. Again, remember, no country really at this point is in stage 1. Okay, so let's go through these themes. I'm going to hit these just with examples today. We're not going to go through them in any great detail. We will see these as we move through each of the modules. So let's begin with the idea of political geography. Political geography as a human component asks the question about power relations, governance, and the state. So when we look at political geography, I want to give you a couple examples here. The first is that the idea of the state. Today we take it for granted that a country is a country. A country is what we deal with on a political level. But we have to recognize that that's really a new idea. States, in the modern sense, have really only been around for about 150 years. Prior to that, with very few exceptions, these were kingdoms, monarchies, and what we meant by a boundary was somewhat more vague. Today, we'll use the United Nations as an example. State sovereignty, that is, a state exists because it enacts its own laws and the rest of the world respects its internal politics. But remember, that's not true everywhere. What you see here are those states that at least one other state in the United Nations doesn't recognize as being a state, doesn't recognize as existing legitimately. And if we look at these, I just want to point out a couple. And this is kind of the classic one. Here we have Taiwan, and here we have China. Well, both these countries say that they are the legitimate governments of mainland China. Mainland China, here, sees Taiwan as a breakaway republic. It still belongs to them, they kind of leave it alone, but it's theirs. Conversely, Taiwan views mainland China as a kind of a usurper of power, and that they view themselves as the only legitimate government. Now, we can also see the same thing literally happening here in North Korea and South Korea. And again, that's worth understanding, especially in terms of what's going on in terms of meetings. North Korea views itself as the only legitimate political party in the Korean Peninsula. South Korea obviously has a difference of opinion in that. And so we see that, and again, you can look at all of these other states, and especially we can think about Palestine and Israel here. differences in terms of who's legitimate and who's not, who owns the Golan Heights, for example, who owns the West Bank, whose territory it is that is. Those are important questions. So not every state is legitimately recognized by everybody else. Now, the other way we can look at this is not only do we look at political geographies of simply what is a state and what isn't, but what we begin to examine is how states function. And one of the interesting ways of looking at this is every year there is a survey that comes out, and essentially it's looking at major businesses that do global business practices, and they rank countries based on the level of corruption that they experience in those countries. And what you'll notice is that, again, different countries have different levels of corruption in terms of their functionality. And what you'll notice, again, is Western Europe, North America are relatively low levels of corruption, although you'll notice that Italy, Spain, Portugal don't come out particularly well here. And then you'll notice Russia comes out fairly poor. And so when we look at this, this is another, politics is about corruption too. It's about, in other words, how does laws function? How do the laws of a country work? Do they work well? Do they work poorly? Do other countries interact with them effectively? And again, we'll look at that a little bit in globalization. So political geographies look at the complex of how the state exists and how the state interacts. Treaties, relationships. That extends then into the idea of economic geography. That is the geographies of production and consumption of goods and services. So one way we understand economic geography is in fact through poverty. That is the distribution of wealth. And so we can think about poverty is economics at the personal scale. And one of the important measures of that is what we call the $2 a day point. Poverty, generally speaking, in the world is viewed as those people that are in absolute poverty live on less than $2 a day per capita, per person. And what you'll notice is that throughout most of Western, in fact, most of Europe, and throughout the Americas, you see that most of that, at least Latin America, Central America, into the United States, we live in a relatively low poverty region. In contrast, when we look at Southeast Asia, South Asia, and Sub-Saharan Africa, we have many countries where significant portions of the population live on less than $2 a day. And by all measures, that is a level of poverty that affects every aspect of their life. So that's micro-scale economic geography. And we can ask questions about why those types of poverty exist. We can also look at economic geographies in terms of trade. And of course, this is a very important issue today, which is trade imbalance and the possibility of a trade war. Well, one way that we can look at that is trading partners. That is the exchange of goods and services between countries. And what we look at here is that we can see that, for example, China's trade geography is much broader than the United States. 124 countries have China as their largest trading partner, whereas the United States has 56. However, it's also a question of which types of countries are, in a sense, in that trade relationship. And so you look at that and we look at where and how that trade exists. Now we can also look at a measure of economic productivity, and for example, one that your book talks about is what we call gross domestic production, okay, GDP, gross domestic production. And that's, in a sense, the value of all goods and services produced in a country. Simple way of saying it. Now that PPP you see after this is purchasing power parity. And that essentially is kind of what we call a hamburger means. That means that we look at not only what a country produces in dollars, but we look at what those dollars actually can buy. And so that's what we mean by purchasing power parity. And what you'll notice here is that when we look at GDP at a global scale, the United States and China are at the top. And then if we kind of break it into regions, we see that the European Union, if we took all of the European Union it would actually be slightly larger in terms of its economic productivity than either China or the United States. But any individual country within it is not as significant in terms of their production. But it is worth noting that that block matters. So again, we can think about economic geographies in terms of how countries relate to each other in terms of their production, how countries relate to themselves in terms of their trade blocks, and how they relate to each other in terms of their personal wealth or poverty. Now, we can also kind of take one little piece of that economics. And so this is an interesting way of looking at the world, because what this shows you is dependency on the travel industry. This is dollars generated by different sectors, and in this case, the travel and tourism sector of the economy. And what you'll notice is that the United States has a very large tourism industry, okay? Almost $500 billion. But that really represents only 5% of our total economy. So it's a lot of money, but it's not the most important part of our economy. Now flip it around. Mexico only makes or produces $79 billion, $80 billion. In other words, essentially one-fifth, a little bit less than one-fifth of our tourism economy. But that accounts for a significant part, more than 7% of their overall economy. And so that matters a lot to them. So economic geographies are also about what people do and how much it matters within their system. All right, so let's pull this all together then into this idea of globalization. The last idea we wanted to talk about is this idea that globalization means the interconnectedness of states within the world. How much are they connected in different ways? And we can talk about globalization again. It is the interconnectedness of systems, of states. And when we talk about globalization, this is what we call the overall globalization index. Higher the globalization index, the more integrated those economies are with the rest of the world. And what you can see is that the United States, all of Western Europe, and in fact much of Europe, is highly integrated. Okay? In fact, at the high end of the globalization index. Sub-Saharan Africa, very low levels of integration. South Asia, moderate level of integration. But now that's an overall measure. Globalization really has three components: economic, social, and political. And if we look at that, we're going to see some differences. When we talk about economic integration or economic globalization, that means how do our markets, in other words, where do we buy, where do we sell, where do we produce, how are economics integrated? And interestingly enough, the United States is not as highly integrated in the global economy as one might think. In part, that's because, and you'll notice that both India and China are also not as integrated. With such large internal populations, the amount of integration economically is less important. You have a lot of people at home to buy and produce for. Okay? So again, economic integration for small countries with small populations kind of force you to go look elsewhere for both sellers and buyers. We are certainly significantly integrated, but we're not at the top. You'll notice that all of the Western European states, the small states in Europe, are highly integrated. Now, politically, it looks very different. The United States, Canada, much of South America, all of Western Europe, and much of Eastern Asia and South Asia are all highly politically globalized. That is that we interact very strongly on a political level. Politics is globalized, and especially for all of the countries that interact in terms of geopolitics and in terms of security. National security, geopolitics tends to pull countries much more into political globalization. Now lastly, we can look at social globalization. An easy way to think about this is how culture is transferred between areas. How much of other cultures has a society adopted, and how much of their culture have they exported? And you can imagine things like music, art, movies, as part of what we would call the social globalization index. And of course, not surprisingly, the United States is very, very high in this, as is all of Western Europe. Interestingly enough, much of Russia is highly socially integrated, and as well as some of the Southeast Asian states and Japan. Now, interestingly enough, again, social globalization in sub-Saharan Africa is very, very low. It is moderate in South America. So globalization has these three components, and they differ from place to place. And as we look at each region, we're going to see how these three elements differ. But what I want you to take away from this, again, is that idea that globalization is the level of interaction and integration. That's our key idea. All right, that is it for the second part of Module 2. That is the last of our video lectures. We'll come back in Module 3, and we'll begin again next week. Make sure that you have read the chapter, make sure that you have completed the Dropbox, and you will be ready to go for Module 3. Until Module 3, we'll see you then.